We begin today with the latest in Ukraine. Over the past week, Ukrainian and Western officials have been accusing Russia of sending thousands of troops into the Crimean region. That's a claim Russia has denied, saying instead that the unidentified troops are local militias. For more on that, earlier I spoke with Paula Sleer, who is on the ground in the region's capital, and I first asked her to clear up the confusion on who these unidentified troops really are.
Well, it's Ukrainian reports essentially that point to the figure of some 30,000, what they say, Russian soldiers who are currently in Ukraine, predominantly in Crimea. Now, the Russian government and the Russian authorities have not confirmed this, and certainly the sense on the ground is that there are no Russian soldiers here, but that rather what we're talking about is self-defense units that have been formed by the local population, local militias. Now, this is supported by social media. For example, if you look at Russian Facebook, there's been a lot of talk there by youngsters saying that they feel unprotected and they feel the need to form themselves into these kind of units to patrol the streets and protect themselves. Most of this is happening in the city of Sevastopol, which is where the Russian military fleet has its headquarters.
And Paula, the March 16th referendum gives Crimea residents two options: to either join Russia or to stay with Ukraine. Do you have a sense as to why there's no third option for them to perhaps vote for complete independence of both countries?
Well, there isn't a third option because essentially this referendum is about choosing the East or choosing the West, if you like. I've been talking to people here on the ground, and the sense I get very much backs the latest polls, which point to a figure of around 60 to 75% of people in Crimea who are going to vote to join with Russia. The latest figures suggest that 23% of Ukrainians here are going to say no, and then you have the smaller number of minorities which make up your Tatars and other such groups. As I say, I've been talking to people here. There is a sense of an historic occasion. That's how one person put it to me. A lot of people saying that they are going to go to that referendum. They believe that they're voting for the future, not only of their lives, but the lives of their children and their grandchildren. And the sense I get is that those polls are accurate and that we're certainly going to see overwhelming support here for moving closer to Russia as opposed to moving closer to the West.
Well, you did just break down the demographic, at what the country is composed of, but I'm going to repeat it. 65% ethnically Russian, the rest are either Ukrainian or other minorities. So even if the people of Crimea vote to join Russia, which is likely based on the percentage of the population, is there a worry that an opposition could then form and protests could reignite once again in the region after this referendum?
I think it's almost a given that there's going to be an opposition. You have the majority who want to go with Russia, but as we've been saying, you are going to have a minority who are against this. We're already hearing reports now of pro-Maidan groups that are armed who are making their way to Crimea to provoke the situation here. So the question's not so much whether or not there's going to be an opposition. The question is, what exactly is this opposition going to do? And certainly the prognosis and the concern is that they're going to conduct violent demonstrations and try to destabilize the situation. And here we return to these self-defense units that we were talking about earlier. They'll be tasked with having to destabilize the situation on the ground. We're talking again about people who come from this area who want to be protecting their homes against any kind of provocations, whether they're provocations from the minority groups here or from groups elsewhere in Ukraine that come to lend their assistance to them.
And Paula, turning to the latest news, a delegation from the Crimean parliament went to Moscow today to discuss the recent events and talk about the future. Was there any reaction in those talks to the recent U.S. imposed sanctions on Russia or even the EU talk of imposing sanctions?
Well, the Crimean delegation is in Moscow until tomorrow, and one of the proposals on the table is actually to make Sevastopol, where you have the Russian military fleet, the capital, and not the city where I'm standing, Simferopol. The Russian President Vladimir Putin reiterated what he said before, and that is that the Ukraine should not become the reason for relations between the West and Russia to deteriorate. He also said, and again he said this before, that sanctions are not going to achieve anything. He said that sanctions will only backfire, and that is a message that the Russian president has given before. Obviously, people here on the ground are watching this meeting very closely, and again, there's a sense that whatever is said in Russia is something that is a message to them, to people here in Crimea.
And President Putin and President Obama talked on the phone for an hour last night. Did anything significant come out of that conversation? What was said?
it doesn't really seem as if there was anything particularly significant from that conversation. Essentially, the two leaders, President Putin and President Obama, agreeing to disagree, and it doesn't seem as if there was any other option for the two leaders at this stage. What I did want to mention is I've just come from a press conference by the organizers of this referendum, and they put it forward as an historic occasion. They said that everything was going to be transparent, that everything was already organized, and that essentially this referendum could be held tomorrow if indeed it was wanted to be. At the same time, we're also closely following a demonstration that's being planned for tomorrow by the minority Tatar community here. They're likely to have slogans that are very anti-Russia, so we'll be watching that closely and seeing whether or not any kind of violence or provocations result from that. And as I say, we're also keeping an eye on those right-wing groups that we're being told are making their way to Crimea for some kind of possible provocation with people here who support Russia.
All right, the referendum is now less than 10 days away. RT's Paula Sleer, thanks for your reporting.